Thứ Bảy cuối tuần qua, ngày 16 tây tháng 11 năm 2013, tại trụ sở ở thành phố Santa Ana, Hội Văn học Nghệ thuật Việt-Mỹ đã tổ chức một buổi ra mắt sách giới thiệu tác phẩm bằng Anh ngữ mang tựa đề It's a Living, Work and Life in Vietnam Today, tạm dịch sang tiếng Việt theo cách của người chủ biên là Kiếm Ăn, Công, việc và đời sống ở Việt Nam ngày nay. Theo tài liệu từ ban tổ chức, cuốn sách này là một tập hợp của nhiều cuộc phỏng vấn do sinh viên đại học ở Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ thực hiện. Sách trình bày những cảm nghĩ về công việc và đời sống qua 67 cuộc phỏng vấn người dân Việt, cho thấy những thay đổi phức tạp mang tính tương quan với nhau trong các lĩnh vực như tuyển người cho công ăn việc làm, tầng lớp xã hội, môi trường, chính trị, văn hóa, giới tính, tính dục. Những câu chuyện kể qua những cuộc phỏng vấn đưa ra một cái nhìn rất đặc biệt và sinh động, không chỉ dừng lại ở một nước Việt Nam trước thềm thế kỷ 21, mà còn tìm hiểu về một quá khứ đầy biến động. Cuốn sách còn là một phần của dân tộc học, chú trọng về những công việc và sự phát triển ở Đông Nam Á, Châu Á và thế giới nói chung, ngưng trích. Thành phần tham dự hầu hết là giới trẻ, sử dụng ngôn ngữ chính là Anh ngữ, do vậy buổi giới thiệu sách hoàn toàn bằng Anh ngữ. Tiến sĩ Gerard Sachs, chủ biên của cuốn sách đã giới thiệu hoàn cảnh ra đời và nội dung của cuốn sách. Sau đó là phần trình bày của các cộng tác viên đã đóng góp trong tác phẩm.
This book came out of this program that I directed in Vietnam between 2002 and 2011. And it was a program for the University of California. And originally I was working for the University of California, but it seemed to me that if our students were to learn as much as possible about Vietnam while they were there, they should study together with Vietnamese students, and then all of them should go out and talk to real Vietnamese people as much as possible. And so as the years went on, I got sort of closer and closer to, sort of perfecting this, and eventually it resulted in this project that we called Project Kiếm Ăn. And Kiếm Ăn in Vietnamese means to look for food, to forage. And in Vietnamese it sounds a little bit harsh almost. And we kind of wanted people to kind of be a little bit taken aback with the title, because our point was to say that whatever people do to make a living, it's worthy of our time to listen to their stories, and it's worthy of our respect. And so that's really sort of what sort of shaped this project from the beginning. Our students would just go out and, we'd look for people, for occupations that were either, maybe disappearing because of the changing economy, or maybe appearing because of the changing economy, or something that's kind of unique to Vietnam, something that's different that other people might want to learn about. And so we would just go out, and no matter what people were doing, we just sort of talk to them about their jobs. The students would do it in groups of 4 typically, so there would be 2 Vietnamese students and 2 American students, and they would do the interviews. They'd write them up in Vietnamese and English, and then we would publish them on our website in both languages. And then when I got to Singapore, I talked to the university press there, and they were interested in doing it as a book, so we got to do it as a book. And I contacted another old student of mine who's, I think, a quite talented photographer, and so she did images to go along with the interviews. Altogether, we did about 150 interviews over the 2 years that we ran the program, and in the book we have 67 interviews. Most of them done by these guys. So I really want to emphasize, I'm just the editor. These guys are the contributors who did all the interviews, except for a couple that I added in afterwards when I started to try and look at the project kind of holistically and think about the story that I was trying to tell about Vietnam.
Sau phần trình bày của tiến sĩ Gerard, cử tọa đã có dịp đặt rất nhiều câu hỏi xung quanh nội dung cuốn sách, cũng như bối cảnh của việc thực hiện các cuộc phỏng vấn, v.v.
What kind of people do you guys target in terms of your interviews? You guys have specific targets, like group age range, or just random?
We were trying to hit as many people as broad a range of society as possible. So we literally interviewed everything from, shoe shiners to CEOs, right? And I would suggest occupations to students, but also you guys could choose things that you thought were interesting, or where you had a connection or something like that. So we really tried to hit as many as broad a spectrum of Vietnamese society as possible.
So this for Gerard as well as the students, like what were some of the biggest challenges that you encountered in going out to do these interviews? Any anecdotes?
For me, the biggest challenge was, because I know how to speak Vietnamese, but when you try to translate a certain question to Vietnamese, or I would talk to my friend Huyan, he's a local Vietnamese. I would be like, hey, can you ask this question? And he tries to ask the question, but then I'm like, wait, no, that's not the question, like this specific way. And then when you try to ask them that question, they don't want to answer it because it's too personal or it's too much information to give us. So it was really challenging to actually ask Vietnamese locals certain questions about, like, you know, how very specific questions about what job they're doing and why they're doing it, or what shady stuff has been going on with this, or whatever it was. That was the biggest challenge to do.
Sometimes just getting them to reveal everything was hard, like you were saying, going back to touching base with that. Because some people are very private about their life, and just interviewing that kind of gets them to open, and then just translating it from either English to Vietnamese or Vietnamese to English is kind of difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Luckily, some people were able to interview people in English and then translate it backwards, and then vice versa. And it's just like, you know, when you're working with your groups, you're just like, that's not what it means, or, you know, trying to figure it out. Because the original goal at the end is just to get the voice of, you know, who we're interviewing.
Yeah, I had it fairly smoothly because 3 of my colleagues were locals, and so if they approached other locals to interview them, you know, there was like a level of trust. But if I were to approach, you know, someone on the street, ask for an interview, you know, it's like, I'm a foreigner, I'm Vicku, they were more reluctant to share their private lives with me. Like, you know, they probably connected it to some kind of political thing, or like I was gonna share it on the media and they would get in trouble. But for the most part, like, I was lucky to have 3 Hanoi University students kind of lead the way for me.
And they didn't allow us to record them in any way, like, or my interviews, they didn't allow that. We would ask, like, can we put a mic to just hear them? But no, so every time they would say something, I would try to translate it in my head and write it in English, because my writing in Vietnamese is really weak. So it was really tough to do that. And then the other 2 students that were Vietnamese locals, they weren't writing any notes. They were just talking like regular conversation. So that was tough to deal with too.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, because of the sort of history and politics and stuff, you can't, you know, nobody's going to sign a release form. So most of except in the case where we're interviewing someone quite famous, all the interviews are anonymous, and nobody wants to be recorded. I mean, there's a lot of fear about that sort of stuff. So, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, these are the challenges that professional anthropologists or professional ethnographers face. Is like, how do you have a genuine conversation with them, but then somehow keep notes about that conversation enough that you can kind of recreate what happened. So it was interesting, you know, working through this process with the students. Like, how do you do these interviews? How do you then edit them but stay, you know, true to what the person was really trying to say? And then, of course, the problem of translation, which is really, you know, very difficult between Vietnamese and English. So, yeah, it was a challenging project.
What the most sensitive topic when you interview the Vietnamese people there?
I think it was political. Actually, it depends on the person you're interviewing. I interviewed one. Was Huyan's dad he's part of the military, and so he couldn't say much. And then I interviewed a real estate agent, and she just said everything. She didn't care. And then the hotel receptionist made it to the book, and he said everything, like everything. So it depends on who you interview. Yeah.
Well, I didn't have too many issues with that because a lot of my interviews are just like street level people, so we never really got to that topic sometimes, just because, you know, in the nature of just interviewing them about their work, some things don't really like go in that area, so I didn't have that issue too many times.
It's interesting that you asked that. You probably resettled in America, in Orange County, right, or in California, right? Because I think a lot of Vietnamese Americans have this perception that it's a taboo topic to talk about politics in Vietnam today, like my dad included. So when I came back, I think people were willing to talk about it. I did a couple other interview projects outside of this book for another project, and people revealed like what was like growing up post-war, during the war, as younger people at the time. And so there was also an interview in here that Gerard interviewed our tour guide, who was our tour guide for Saigon, and his whole story is in here, and it's like a beautiful story, and it reveals a lot of his upbringing and a lot of political stuff, and you'd be surprised that people were willing to talk about it in Vietnam, like in the 2000 century area. Yeah.
I think for me, I don't. Some of my students are they're from 2003 were like, why didn't we do this project in 2003? But honestly, I don't think we could have done the project in 2003 or four. For example, I really found a kind of a shift in people's willingness to talk openly about like explicitly political topics around 2007, 2008. And, that's sort of when the economy started to kind of go to tank a little bit. And I was just stunned at, people I did not know using words like, multi-party democracy and, and I'm just sort of like, you're not supposed to use that word. This is the anecdote that I used to start off the introduction is, I was sitting in just having I like talking to taxi drivers, so I was talking with the taxi driver and, on one day on the way out to the university, and he said, so he's sort of looking at me sort of in the mirror, and he's like, all these wonderful material gains that we've had, the economic growth we've had over the last 20 years have been thanks to the free market, thanks to people's ability to choose between different products so that the better product wins. He's like, if Vietnam is going to continue to develop, it must have a free market in politics as well. And he so he looks at me in the mirror and he's like, anh có hiểu không? Do you understand? And I'm like, hiểu. So I was just, given that most, really I do feel quite a serious change starting around 2007, 2008, which has continued to this day, and which I think in some ways made this project possible.
Question for Gerald. As an editor, do you publish all of the story as 100%, or you edit out some part, either by your decision or by your commitment to the people who interview?
Some of both. I mean, the first editors were actually the students, right? And we do have like I said, most, except if the interview is of a well-known person, the interviews are anonymous. We don't want anyone to have any repercussions. So, and some of the details might be changed so that people are not identifiable, because you never know what might end up being sensitive. So, I mean, we do have a responsibility to the people we're talking to. Other than that, I think the main thing that I tried to do, and I tried to underline with the students, was just as try and be true to the voice and the story that you heard, right? And that's, I think, I hope what we accomplished with our editing.
So, I've been around the world, seen Asia, Australia, Europe, and America, and I still haven't found any place that can compare to Vietnam. I don't know how to explain it, but there's just something so wonderful about this country. The diversity from north to south and east to west, the cheerful people, the great food, man, I love it. It may sound corny, but my goal is for our customers to love this country like I do. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to the airport to pick up the same Australian couple that was on my company's very first tour back in the summer of 2010. This will be their 5th tour with us, and they recommended more than 50 other clients to us. To thank them for their support, I've organized a honeymoon in Vietnam for their son and his bride, all expenses paid. Doing business this way is never going to make me rich, but it does allow me to share my passion for this wonderful place. Sure, life in Vietnam hasn't always been easy. Sure, living and working in Vietnam today has its frustration. But for me, I just want to put politics and history aside and focus on sharing my love for Vietnam and its people. And so that was special to me because I think growing up, I was born in California. Growing up, and my dad was in the army for the Southern Vietnamese Social Republic, and he kind of instilled this stigma of the politics, the war, what Vietnam meant to him growing up. And so EAP was my first time, visiting Vietnam, and it was to search for my roots. And I think it was beautiful that this tour guide said that he loves Vietnam and he's been through the war, he lived after the war, and his life's goal is to make people fall in love with Vietnam. And it made me think, like, after all the trauma and war that my dad and my mom went through, like, what part of them, secretly is, like, still in love with Vietnam and misses all the beautiful things about it. Because I think in our trip, we really got to see the beauty of it for his people, the food, the nature, and all the other elements aside from all the social and political stigma that I personally grew up with. So.
Even though the book is about living, Kiếm Ăn, I'm gonna put a political question here. In Vietnam, the government tried to portray that most of the people happy with the political system in Vietnam right now. On the other side, many people or organizations here against that government try to portray that most of the Vietnamese, out of 90 million people, not happy with the government and try to overthrow the government if they have the chance. So in your projects, you probably have a lot of encounter with the people. What is your feeling? What is your observe regarding that matter?
Yeah, well, as I suggested at the beginning, I think particularly since 2007, 2008, people are, basically before that, since Doi Moi, there was basically the sort of a social contract in the sense that as long as people's material, the standards of living in a material sense were getting better, folks were okay with corruption and incompetence and bad, the failings of the political system in Vietnam. And I think since 2007, 2008, that contract sort of stopped operating because for many people, standards of living stopped improving. So I think people are increasingly openly critical of this the situation of the status quo. How that will translate into change, I don't know. So I'm going to suggest now that we have some wine and some beer. You can circulate, talk to these folks, because really these are the people that did this book, and just enjoy. Okay? Thank you so much.
Qua cái buổi ra mắt sách đây, em cũng học được nhiều cái điều mới ở bên Việt Nam. Tại em qua đây cũng lâu rồi mà không có dịp về Việt Nam, cho nên mua cuốn sách này để mình learn and mình biết thêm về Việt Nam bây giờ họ sống ra sao.
Tiếp xúc với phố Bosa TV sau buổi giới thiệu sách, tiến sĩ Gerard cho biết.
Anh đến Việt Nam lần đầu tiên là năm 2000. Lúc đó thì tôi là nghiên cứu sinh của Đại học California ở khoa sử học, và tôi đến Việt Nam để nghiên cứu về một số đề tài có liên quan đến luận án tiến sĩ của tôi. Và sau 2 năm ở Việt Nam thì Đại học California mời tôi làm giám đốc của một chương trình giao lưu giữa trường Đại học California và một số trường đại học ở Việt Nam. Chủ yếu là tôi phụ trách phải lo về các em sinh viên Mỹ sang Việt Nam học. Nhưng mà sau vài năm làm giám đốc chương trình thì tôi định muốn là chương trình này có sinh viên có nhiều cơ hội hơn để giao lưu với sinh viên Việt Nam. Và sau vài năm này tôi tạo một môn học đặc biệt có cả sinh viên Việt Nam và sinh viên Mỹ tham gia cùng nhau ở trong lớp. Và sau vài năm nữa thì tôi có ý kiến là tôi muốn làm một dự án để sinh viên được đi ra ngoài phòng học để học hỏi người dân Việt Nam, và tôi dùng chủ đề là công việc của mình, là việc làm của mình, và mình gọi dự án này là dự án Kiếm Ăn. Vì ý của chúng tôi là chúng tôi muốn nhấn mạnh lại là tất cả mọi công việc nào cũng là một cách để kiếm ăn, để có đủ ăn để sống này. Và mình nên, mặc dù là đây là công việc nào thì mình cũng nên tôn trọng người làm công việc đấy.
Các cộng tác viên góp mặt trong cuốn sách đều là các cựu sinh viên từng theo học lớp của tiến sĩ Gerard, đều sinh ra và lớn lên tại Mỹ, lần đầu tiên biết đến Việt Nam qua chương trình du học ngắn hạn tại Đại học Bách khoa Hà Nội. Khóa học tại Việt Nam và cơ hội tham gia vào việc thực hiện tác phẩm này đã để lại cho họ nhiều ấn tượng đặc biệt về nguồn gốc Việt Nam của mình.
Thật sự nhiều người ta ở Việt Nam mà gốc như người Mỹ gốc Việt ở đây như không có hiểu ở người Việt Nam ở Việt Nam vui vẻ hơn nhiều hơn ở đây. Ở đây muốn kiếm tiền hoài, muốn đi chơi gì đó. Nhưng mà ở Việt Nam thật sự gia đình là số 1 quan trọng nhất rồi. Nhưng mà ở đây ở Mỹ người ta mua xe mới hoài, mua điện thoại mới hoài, mua hết cái này hoài á. Ở Việt Nam mua một bánh xèo gì á, cái đó vui rồi, không có cần cái gì hết rồi, không có. Thì thật sự em đi về Việt Nam cái em về đây em đâu có cần điện thoại mới đâu. Xe của em là xe Honda Civic 2001 đâu có mới đâu, không cần thiết. Phải đi chơi cho mấy mẹ là số 1, đi chơi cho mấy anh là số 1 luôn, cho mấy chị, cho mấy cha hay đồ á. Thì thật sự ở người Việt Nam em sẽ nghĩ người Việt Nam ở Việt Nam biết làm bạn nhiều hơn ở đây. Làm bạn là bạn với gia đình nó là số 1 ở bên đó đó. Nhưng mà ở đây nếu mà bạn này không có tốt không có thích thì nói chuyện hoài, có súp hoài. Nếu mà Việt Nam chỉ đưa một chai bia, cái nhậu uống bia hút thuốc vui vẻ hơn. Thì thật sự em bây giờ em ở Mỹ em suy nghĩ có nhiều cái em không có giận nữa. Có ai làm cái này đâu có giận đâu, không sao nữa. Thì thật sự ở Việt Nam em thấy nó vui hơn để nhiều người ta biết. Biết suy nghĩ, không có lo cái này, không có lo tiền, không có lo nọ, nhưng mà lo làm sao làm em bé vui hơn, làm với tao vui hơn tôi vui hơn. Thì thật sự em hãy đi học thấy Việt Nam vui hơn ở đây rồi.
Sống ở Mỹ thì thường ba mẹ mà qua đây thấy khổ khăn lắm, nghĩ là Việt Nam là đời khác, Việt Nam là rất khác hơn. So I was born in San Jose, California, and I grew up in America. So going to Vietnam, that was my first time, and my first time was 5 months long. And I think once I entered college, I started to think about where I was from and, my identity as a Vietnamese American. Sometimes in America, people think, people look at us as Asians, but in other countries, people see us as Americans. So there's always a struggle of our identity growing up in this certain generation. And I was always wondered, where am I from and where did my parents come from? I hear about these painful stories, but I still was curious to know, what does that country look like? And a lot of my friends who came through the program, they was highly recommended. I saw them come back from Vietnam and their mind was transformed, their perspective was transformed, and I really wanted to see what that was all about. And so I'm really thankful for all the mentors who came before me, who met Gerard and came back and said, Tracy, before you graduate the university, you have to go here. And so I listened to their advice, and it was one of the best decisions I made in my life.
Theo tài liệu từ ban tổ chức, giáo sư Gerard Sachs nhận bằng tiến sĩ từ phân khoa lịch sử tại Đại học Berkeley vào năm 2006. Từ năm 2002 tới năm 2011, ông làm giám đốc chương trình giáo dục ở nước ngoài cho hệ thống Đại học California tại Hà Nội, Việt Nam. Năm 2012, ông bắt đầu giảng dạy tại phân khoa Đông Nam Á thuộc Đại học Quốc gia Singapore, nơi ông tiếp tục nghiên cứu về những quá trình chính trị, kinh tế và những thay đổi trong xã hội ảnh hưởng đến đời sống và con người Việt Nam. Tiến sĩ Gerard Sachs nói và viết thông thạo tiếng Việt.